Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, and their parliamentary secretaries and their teams for their work on this important legislation and thank them for their efforts. I would also like to thank the Chair and members of the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying, the witnesses they heard from, and the countless Canadians who took part in consultations right across the country. This is not an easy topic for discussion, and I commend all involved for your thoughtful, compassionate, and thorough work. Mr. Speaker, the Carter decision set out a clear objective for parliamentarians: to come up with a legislative framework that allows Canadians who are suffering intolerably the right to request assistance to end their suffering. Bill C-14 is the government's answer to this critical objective, and I stand here today proud to support this important legislation. I have heard from constituents on both sides of the issue, some who flatly oppose allowing any access to medical assistance in death, and others who believe the legislation does not go far enough. I've also heard from people who applaud the thoughtful work on this bill and have reached out to me to express their gratitude. In this regard, it is important to note and to reiterate what has been mentioned many times in this chamber. With this legislation, our task was not to determine if physician-assisted dying was necessary, but to determine how best to move it forward. This is an important consideration and one that is worth repeating. Of paramount importance to me in reviewing this bill was to determine if it properly considers different interests, including balancing the right to personal autonomy at the end of life with the need to ensure robust protection for the most vulnerable in our society. I believe that this legislation achieves this balance and that it rightly takes the necessary steps to ensure that the rights of all are respected. With respect to personal autonomy, this legislation responds to the objective mentioned earlier, provided to us by the Supreme Court of Canada, that Canadians who are suffering intolerably have the right to request assistance to end their suffering. Mr. Speaker, I am not a lawyer, and as such will not speak to the legal ramifications of this bill. As well, I cannot speak with authority on the constitutional nuances of this bill. However, as a person of faith, it was critically important to me that Section 2A of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which grants Canadians the freedom of conscience and religion, was considered and protected. A couple of weeks ago, I had a meeting in my office with members from St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Whitby. While they understood that the objective for us in this chamber was to come up with a legislative framework for medical assistance in dying, they were gravely concerned about protecting the conscience of medical professionals. They wanted some assurance that the conscience of the healthcare provider was protected. Balancing the rights of medical providers and those of the patient is generally a matter of provincial and territorial concern. However, our government is committed to working with the provinces and territories to explore options to facilitate access and care coordination while recognizing the personal convictions of healthcare providers. Having worked in healthcare-based research for the bulk of my professional life, I've had the opportunity to work closely with healthcare professionals in a variety of capacities. It is very important to me that any legislation put forward respected the rights and personal convictions of care providers. I am very pleased to see this legislation makes mention of this while acknowledging that safeguarding those convictions requires an ongoing conversation with the provinces and territories. The robust consideration and protections for the most vulnerable in our society inherent in this legislation are also of particular importance. This legislation sets out the criteria for the determination by medical professionals as to whether or not a patient suffers from a grievous or irremediable medical condition. These criteria include that they have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, are in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, that the state of decline causes them enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to them, and that cannot be relieved under conditions that they consider acceptable, and that their natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. As a mother of 3 children, an MP for the bedroom communities in my riding of Whitby, I was pleased that the legislation also includes strict eligibility requirements that protect minors. Careful thought and consideration are required to understand and assess a minor's ability to make a decision involving the termination of their life. I applaud the decision to further study this aspect of the legislation and look forward to being actively involved at that time. Additionally, this legislation ensures those who make a request for assisted dying do so without coercion, having provided informed consent, and given the opportunity to, at any time and in any manner, withdraw their consent. These safeguards are fundamental to Bill C-14. The bill provides safeguards to ensure that individuals can remove consent. The requirements that the request be voluntary and that the person must decide for themselves that they want medical assistance in dying is equally as important as the requirement to have the ability to remove consent. Mr. Speaker, I am proud that this government has listened to stakeholders from across the country and has committed to ensuring that all Canadians have access to quality end-of-life care, including palliative care. Our $3 billion commitment to improving and expanding access to home care is another critically important step, and I'm looking forward to seeing continued progress on this vital portfolio in the months ahead. Mr. Speaker, finally, I would like to thank and acknowledge my colleagues in this chamber for their thoughtful, measured, and respectful tone struck during this debate. This is not an easy topic of discussion. It is one that challenges us to examine our fundamental beliefs about life and about death. I commend all for their work on this file. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is good to hear the member talk about how she sees the protection of conscience as very important. But I would simply ask, why not include it? Why not protect it in the legislation? There's, of course, precedent for this. We've talked about the Civil Marriage Act, including protection for conscience at the federal level. A similar model could be used, but essentially what we're being told from the government is, here we're talking about it, now why don't you just take our word for it? Well, taking their word for it just isn't good enough. We want to see conscience protection included in the legislation. And I also want to ask the member, does she clearly understand that protection of conscience includes the right to choose not to refer? Because there's been some confusion about that, I think, from some other members. Respecting an individual's conscience includes their right to not only not provide a service, but not to be complicit in providing the service by using a formal, effective referral. Physicians don't have an objection to providing information, of course, and to facilitating the orderly transfer of records. But there's a big difference between that and formal referral. So I'd appreciate the member's comment on that as well.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable colleague for his question. With respect to the right for a physician not to refer, as I said in my comments, this is going to the provinces and the territories for them to determine, and with the help of the government, to be able to provide and to respect the conscience rights of our physicians. The question about referrals did come up in my riding, and there were many concerned about that. And I'd hope that that consideration is part of an ongoing conversation with the provinces and territories and with medical professionals.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député d'Hochelaga.
Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the Parliamentary Secretary if the member might have some further information for us regarding the financing one might expect for palliative care, because as she knows, in the last budget there were no sums provided, no new undertakings either under C14. Might she give us some further information about that?
Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question. As the Minister of Health has stated many times in this House, she is in constant dialogue with the provinces and territories to renew the Health Accord, and there is a commitment of $3 billion in the budget to look at end-of-life care, including home care and palliative care. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just maybe a follow-up to my previous question. To put a finer point on it, the current policy of the College of Physicians and Surgeons Ontario right now is to require referral if something falls within the standard of care, or in an emergency or urgent situation to actually require the provision of that service. So this isn't something that can wait for further consultation, because if this legislation passes, then right away, after June 6th or whenever this takes effect, it will be required in Ontario for physicians to either refer or potentially to provide this service. So if the member accepts the value of protecting conscience, recognizing that this could be the reality, this could be the outcome in her riding once this legislation passes right away, would she not support immediate changes to this legislation which formally, directly ensure the protection of conscience in that legislation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank you again for the question. I do respect the fact that there are jurisdictional boundaries with respect to what we can and cannot legislate, and the provinces and territories have the jurisdiction over this particular aspect, and the government will continue to work with the provinces and territories to ensure that the conscience rights of our medical professionals are taken into consideration with respect to this bill. Thank you.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable.
Madam Bro, thank you.